For most of the 20th century, one company decided what memory looked like. Weddings, wars, first steps, family vacations, the surface of the moon, all of it passed through the same yellow box. At its height, this company employed more people in a single American city than most cities have residents. It ran its own power plants, it ran its own railroad. It even kept a small nuclear reactor humming quietly on its own campus to test film for radiation sensitivity. By the early 1990s, it was one of the 5 most recognized brands on Earth, sitting in the same company as Coca-Cola and Disney. And then, in the space of about 15 years, it disappeared. Bankruptcy, liquidation, tens of thousands of jobs gone, a stock that had traded above $90 reduced to a few pennies. Ask almost anyone what happened, and you'll get the same answer. Kodak didn't see digital cameras coming. They got caught flat-footed by new technology, the way old companies always do, and they paid for it. It's a tidy story. It fits the pattern we expect from once great companies that die. A management team too comfortable, too slow, too blind to notice the ground shifting under them until it was too late. It's also the kind of story that lets everyone watching feel a little safer, because it implies the failure was a failure of intelligence, and surely we would have seen it coming. That answer is wrong. Not wrong in a small, technical way, wrong in almost the opposite direction of the truth. Kodak didn't fail to see digital photography coming. Kodak invented it. One of their own engineers built the first digital camera on Earth, more than 3 decades before the company went bankrupt, inside Kodak's own labs, using Kodak's own money. The company didn't miss the future. They built it, tested it, understood exactly what it meant, and then made a series of very deliberate, very rational decisions that walked them straight into the ground anyway. That's a much stranger and, honestly, much scarier story than the one most people already believe. It's not a story about a company that failed to notice a threat. It's a story about a company that saw the threat with total clarity, calculated the danger correctly, and still couldn't stop itself from walking toward it, because everyone inside the building was being rewarded for doing exactly that. This is the real story of how that happened, and why the company that invented modern photography couldn't survive it. To understand how strange the ending was, you have to understand how completely this company built the world it eventually lost. The story starts in 1878, with a bank clerk in Rochester, New York, named George Eastman. Eastman wanted to photograph a trip he was planning, and quickly discovered that photography, as it existed at the time, was not something an amateur could simply pick up. A camera weighed as much as a small piece of furniture. You needed a portable darkroom, a chest of glass plates, and a working knowledge of chemistry just to take a single picture. Eastman, who had no formal training in any of this, began spending his evenings at his mother's kitchen table trying to simplify the process. He wasn't trying to build a company. He was trying to make picture-taking possible for someone like himself. By 1888, he had done it. He introduced a camera preloaded with flexible roll film, and he gave the whole system a name that meant nothing in any language, because he wanted something short, memorable, and impossible to mispronounce anywhere in the world. Kodak. The slogan he built around it explained the entire business model in 8 words. You press the button, we do the rest. The customer didn't need to know chemistry. They took the photos, mailed the whole camera back to Rochester, and the company developed the film, printed the pictures, reloaded the camera, and shipped it back. It's worth pausing on how radical that idea actually was at the time. Eastman wasn't just simplifying a device. He was removing an entire category of specialized human expertise from a process and replacing it with a service. Decades before software as a service or any modern equivalent existed as a concept. He'd effectively figured out that the real value wasn't in the machine a customer owned. It was in the ongoing relationship the company maintained with that customer every time they wanted a new set of memories developed. That insight, more than any single patent, is what built Kodak into a durable empire rather than a one-time novelty. In 1900, Eastman went further, releasing the Brownie camera for $1, a price point deliberately chosen to put a camera within reach of almost anyone with a steady job. The Brownie sold 150,000 units in its first year. Within 5 years, Kodak had sold 10 million of them. Photography stopped being a specialized craft, practiced by professionals, and became something ordinary families did on a Sunday afternoon. Eastman hadn't just built a camera company, he had invented the snapshot as a cultural habit. Over the following decades, that habit turned Kodak into one of the most dominant corporations in American history. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface in 1969, the camera capturing the moment was a Kodak. But the detail most people miss is that Kodak was never really a camera company at all. Cameras were the delivery mechanism. The actual business, the part that generated almost all of the profit, was film. This was a classic razor and blades model, decades before that phrase existed. Cameras were sold cheaply, sometimes even at a loss, because the real money was in the consumable that customers had to keep buying, rolls of film, and the processing and printing that followed. Film margins ran as high as 80%. In 1985, a Kodak executive told the Wall Street Journal, with no apparent irony, that it was hard to find anything else legal that was that profitable. By the mid-1970s, Kodak controlled roughly 90% of film sales and 85% of camera sales in the United States. Their only serious global rival was a Japanese company called Fujifilm, and that rivalry, largely ignored for decades, is going to matter enormously by the end of this story. The scale of what Kodak built around that film business is easy to understate. By the early 1980s, the company employed around 60,000 people in Rochester alone, and it operated with a degree of vertical integration that would be almost unthinkable for a modern corporation. Kodak owned coal operations to help power its own plants. It ran factories that processed cattle hooves and bones into the gelatin used as the base layer of photographic film. It maintained its own fire department and its own rail lines to move materials between facilities. For a period of years, the company even operated a small nuclear reactor on its own property, used to test film stock for sensitivity to radiation. Rochester, New York wasn't just a city where Kodak had a large office. Rochester was, in almost every practical sense, a company town, built around the assumption that Kodak's film business would keep growing indefinitely. That scale created enormous strengths. It also created a kind of institutional gravity, a fortress mentality, built up over generations, where the company's entire identity, culture, and internal logic were organized around defending and extending a single, extraordinarily profitable product. By 1996, Kodak had reached the absolute peak of its power, $16 billion in annual revenue, a market capitalization of roughly $30 billion, and a workforce in Rochester that had grown even larger than it was a decade earlier. The company wasn't just an employer in Rochester. It was the reason Rochester existed as an industrial city at all. That same year, 1996, is also when the collapse quietly began. And the reason it began is the part of the story almost nobody tells correctly. 20 years earlier, in 1975, a 24-year-old Kodak engineer named Steve Sasson had been given a fairly open-ended assignment: figure out whether the company's charge-coupled device sensors could be used to capture an image electronically instead of on film. Working largely on his own, Sasson built a machine that weighed close to 8 pounds, was roughly the size of a toaster, took 23 seconds to capture a single black and white image at a resolution of about 100 by 100 pixels, and stored that image on a cassette tape. It was slow, bulky, and produced pictures that looked almost nothing like a photograph. But it worked. It was, unambiguously, the first digital camera ever built. Sasson brought it to Kodak's management, plugged it into a television set, and demonstrated it live. According to his own later accounts, the reaction from the executives in the room wasn't disbelief or dismissal. It was closer to quiet alarm. They understood exactly what they were looking at. This wasn't a fringe experiment with no bearing on the business. It was a direct, working alternative to the film and processing model that generated the vast majority of the company's profit. Kodak didn't ignore this discovery. They studied it. Internal researchers were commissioned to estimate how long it would take for digital photography to become commercially viable and widely adopted, and their projections landed somewhere around 15 to 20 years out, which, in hindsight, turned out to be roughly accurate. Kodak leadership had, in effect, been handed an internal roadmap to their own disruption, complete with a rough timeline, a working prototype, and the engineer who built it standing in the room. And their response was to tell Sasson, essentially, to keep the technology quiet and not talk about it outside the company. Not because they doubted it worked, because they understood too well what it would do to the business if it got out ahead of schedule. It's tempting, hearing this, to conclude that Kodak's executives were simply short-sighted or foolish. That's the comfortable version of the story, because it lets you believe this kind of failure couldn't happen to a well-run company. But the more accurate and more uncomfortable explanation is that everyone inside Kodak was behaving completely rationally according to the incentives they were operating under, and that rational behavior is exactly what destroyed the company. Consider how the incentives actually lined up. Middle managers were compensated based on how much revenue and profit their divisions generated that year, and film generated far more of both than any digital alternative could, especially in its earliest, roughest form. Senior executives were evaluated by shareholders on quarterly and annual performance, not on decisions that might pay off 15 years later under a different CEO. Board members had a fiduciary obligation to protect the value of the company as it existed in the present, for the shareholders who owned it today, not for a hypothetical version of the company that might exist in 2010. At every single level of the organization, from a mailroom clerk up through the boardroom, the rational, career-preserving, shareholder-protecting decision was the same: defend the business that was working right now for as long as it could possibly be defended. Nobody in that chain of command had a strong personal incentive to ask, how do we make sure Kodak still exists and still thrives 30 years from now? That question simply didn't attach to anyone's bonus, anyone's re-election to the board, or anyone's next quarterly earnings call. This problem has a name in business theory. It's called the innovator's dilemma, a concept formalized by the Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen. The very structures, incentives, and expertise that make a company successful in its existing market are frequently the exact things that make it structurally incapable of responding to a disruptive technology, even when the company sees that technology coming years in advance. Kodak is arguably the single most cited case study of this phenomenon, but it's far from the only one. Blockbuster had a chance to buy Netflix outright in the early 2000s and turned it down. Nokia and BlackBerry both saw the smartphone coming and had years of lead time to respond, and both missed regardless. Sears killed its own catalog business roughly 2 years before Amazon was even founded, sitting on a logistics and distribution advantage that could have made it the dominant force in e-commerce. In every one of these cases, the pattern is identical. The company wasn't blindsided. Leadership inside each of these organizations saw the threat coming, understood it, and studied it. What they lacked was the structural ability to act on that knowledge in time, because acting on it meant deliberately damaging a highly profitable existing business before the new one was ready to replace it, and nobody in a large, professionally managed corporation is typically rewarded for doing that. It also helps to understand why the threat is so hard to act on even once it's identified. A new technology like digital photography usually enters the world in a rough, inferior form. Early digital images looked worse than film. They cost more per image to produce at scale. The cameras were bulkier and slower. Judged purely on quality in its first years, digital photography was, by almost every objective measure, a worse product than what Kodak already sold. That's precisely what makes this kind of disruption so dangerous. It doesn't look like a threat while there's still time to respond to it comfortably. It looks like a toy. By the time the inferior technology has improved enough to be obviously superior, the window to respond gradually and profitably has usually already closed, and the only options left are drastic ones. There's also a pattern in who is capable of making that kind of move. Venture capital firms will often only invest in a company if the founder is still running it and still holds a meaningful ownership stake, precisely because founder-operators are far more willing to make bet-the-company decisions that professional, hired management structures avoid. By the 1990s, nobody sitting around Kodak's boardroom table was a founder with that kind of ownership stake and that kind of personal stake in the company's long-term survival. They were caretakers of an enormously profitable, enormously fragile machine, and their job, as they understood it, was to keep that machine running as long as possible. To be fair to them, Kodak did try to respond to the coming disruption. They just never tried hard enough to actually bet the company on it, and the attempts they made reveal exactly how trapped they were inside their own existing business model. In 1996, the same year Kodak hit its financial peak, and arguably the last year the company had the resources to pivot decisively, the company invested roughly $500 million developing a new film format called Advantix. This was, in other words, a major strategic investment made at the exact moment digital technology was becoming commercially viable, and the investment was in making film slightly better. Over the following years, total spending tied to defending the film business ran into the billions. Kodak did enter the digital camera market, and for a brief window they actually did well at it, capturing around 27% of the US digital camera market by 1999. But they built their digital strategy on the assumptions of their film strategy, and that mismatch was fatal. Analysts at the time estimated Kodak was losing roughly $60 on every digital camera it sold, because the company was pricing cameras the same way it always had, as a loss-leading delivery mechanism for a lucrative consumable, in this case prints. The problem was that people didn't treat digital photos the way they treated film photos. They didn't want to print them. They wanted to view them on a screen, store them, and eventually share them. Kodak had built an entire digital strategy around the assumption that customers would keep paying for printing, and that assumption turned out to be almost entirely wrong. At the same time, Kodak was trying to diversify its way out of its film dependency, and most of those attempts reveal a company reasoning by surface-level similarity rather than genuine strategic advantage. In 1988, Kodak spent $5.1 billion acquiring a pharmaceutical company called Sterling Drug. The internal logic was straightforward and, on paper, sounded reasonable. Film production is fundamentally a chemistry business, and pharmaceuticals are also a chemistry business, so Kodak's chemical expertise should translate. In practice, manufacturing photographic film and manufacturing consumer pharmaceuticals share almost nothing in terms of distribution, regulation, sales channels, or customer relationships. The acquisition added significant debt, consumed management attention that could have gone toward the actual disruption bearing down on the company, and was eventually unwound piece by piece at a loss. Kodak also had a genuinely strong, profitable healthcare imaging division, X-ray film, diagnostic imaging equipment, the kind of business with real technical moats and real staying power. But because the company was hemorrhaging cash trying to prop up its core film business, it sold off that healthcare imaging division in 2007, just before the broader medical imaging market began to accelerate. They sold a healthy limb to keep feeding a dying one. Perhaps the most striking missed opportunity came in 2001, when Kodak acquired a small online photo-sharing site called Ophoto for a relatively modest sum. Ophoto was, in essence, an early version of what would eventually become Instagram, a platform for uploading, storing, and sharing digital photos with other people, roughly a decade ahead of its time. But Kodak's leadership couldn't see it that way, because they were still viewing every new technology through the lens of the printing business. They treated Ophoto not as a potential social network in its own right, but simply as a funnel meant to drive more digital photo printing. A decade later, Instagram, a company with a total of 13 employees at the time, was acquired by Facebook for $1 billion. Ophoto, the company that got there first, was sold off for around $25 million during Kodak's bankruptcy proceedings. Kodak didn't just miss the social photography wave. They owned a boat that could have ridden it and used it to fish instead. The compounding effect of all of this was brutal and mechanical. As film sales began their permanent decline after 2001, nothing inside Kodak scaled up fast enough or profitably enough to replace that lost revenue. Between 2003 and 2011, the company shed roughly 47,000 jobs, closed 13 film manufacturing plants, and shut down more than 100 processing labs. In 1999, Kodak had posted a profit of $2.5 billion. By 2011, it posted a loss of $222 million. In January of 2012, at 131 years old, Eastman Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, listing roughly $5 billion in assets against more than $7 billion in debt. The stock that had once traded above $90 a share was, by that point, worth a few cents. Here's the detail that turns this from a sad story about inevitable disruption into something much sharper. Kodak's closest competitor faced the exact same threat on the exact same timeline with the exact same warning signs, and survived it. Fujifilm was Kodak's counterpart in the old film duopoly, and by the early 2000s, film represented an even larger share of Fujifilm's business than it did Kodak's, around 60% of sales and 70% of profits in the year 2000. Within a decade, that core business would be almost entirely wiped out by digital photography, exactly as it was for Kodak. Fuji had no special advantage in seeing this coming. They saw the exact same disruption, arriving on the exact same schedule. What was different was the man running the company. In 2003, an executive named Shigetaka Komori became CEO of Fujifilm, and he made a decision that nobody in a comparable position at Kodak had been willing or able to make. He stopped trying to save the film business. Instead of pouring resources into defending a shrinking, doomed product line the way Kodak had with Advantix, Komori began shutting down Fuji's film manufacturing and processing infrastructure directly, and redirected that capital toward genuine transformation rather than surface-level extensions of the existing business. The distinction matters enormously. Kodak's executives had asked a fairly shallow question when looking for new markets. What other businesses sound similar to what we already do? That's the reasoning that led them to pharmaceuticals, because pharmaceuticals also involve chemistry. Komori asked a fundamentally different and much sharper question. What specific, hard-to-replicate technical capabilities does this company actually possess? And what markets could those capabilities dominate, even if they don't superficially resemble our current business? It turned out Fujifilm, like Kodak, had roughly 80 years of accumulated expertise in producing and stabilizing collagen and gelatin compounds, which had been essential to manufacturing photographic film. That expertise also happened to translate directly into skincare and anti-aging science, because collagen degradation and oxidation are central to both film fading and skin aging. In 2011, Fujifilm launched a skincare line called Astalift, built directly on that decades-old chemical expertise, and it became a genuine commercial hit in Japan. Fuji applied the same logic to its deep, decades-long expertise in oxidation and light sensitivity chemistry to build a serious position in pharmaceuticals and regenerative medicine, succeeding in a chemistry-adjacent field where Kodak's more superficial sterling drug acquisition had failed, and where Kodak sold off its healthy medical imaging division in 2007 to fund a dying film business. Fujifilm expanded aggressively into medical imaging and diagnostics during that same window, effectively picking up the opportunity Kodak was actively discarding. Today, photographic film accounts for less than 1% of Fujifilm's total revenue. The company is a healthcare, materials science, and electronics conglomerate worth close to $30 billion. Kodak, meanwhile, emerged from bankruptcy as a much smaller, largely irrelevant, commercial printing and imaging company, a fraction of the size and influence it once had. Komori himself has been candid in later interviews that Fuji's transformation wasn't purely a matter of foresight or genius. He acknowledged that if the 2008 financial crisis had hit just a year or two earlier in the process, Fujifilm might not have had the capital or the runway to complete the pivot at all. Timing and circumstance mattered, but the willingness to absorb short-term pain, write off a business that had defined the company for a century, and personally take on the career risk of a transformation that might not have worked, that part wasn't luck. That was a decision Kodak's leadership structure was never able to make. As for Steve Sasson, the engineer who built that first digital camera back in 1975, he stayed at Kodak for decades, continued working in imaging research, and retired from the company in 2009, 3 years before it filed for bankruptcy. His original prototype now sits in the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, preserved as the literal first digital camera ever built. It's a strange kind of monument, proof that the company didn't fail to imagine the future. One of their own employees built it, inside their own labs, and then had to watch, for over 3 decades, as the institution around him proved structurally unable to use what he'd made. There's one more layer to this worth sitting with. The wave of standalone digital camera companies that eventually displaced Kodak in the 2000s, the Canons, the Nikons, the countless smaller digital camera brands that briefly thrived, were themselves disrupted less than a decade later by an entirely different device, the smartphone. The camera built into a phone became good enough, fast enough, that carrying a separate camera at all started to feel unnecessary for most people. Many of the very companies that had displaced Kodak found themselves fighting the identical fight Kodak had lost, against a threat that arrived even faster than digital photography had. It's a reminder that disruption doesn't spare the disruptors. It's a mechanism, not a one-time event, and it comes for whoever is sitting on top of the current model, regardless of how they got there. What actually killed Kodak, in the end, wasn't a failure of vision. It was a company built so effectively around one extraordinarily profitable product that every single person inside it, acting entirely rationally according to the incentives in front of them, chose to protect that product for as long as possible, right up until there was nothing left to protect. Fujifilm faced the identical threat on the identical timeline and made the opposite choice, to let the golden goose die on its own terms, and use what it had learned raising that goose to build something new. There's a broader pattern buried in this story that goes well beyond one camera company, and it's worth sitting with because it applies just as much to industries being disrupted right now as it did to film in the 1990s. Disruption rarely announces itself as a surprise to the people inside the company being disrupted. In case after case, Kodak, Blockbuster, Nokia, Sears, and plenty of others, the internal experts saw the threat early, sometimes years or even decades early, and produced remarkably accurate internal forecasts about when it would arrive. The failure was never really a failure of information. It was a failure of incentive structure. Large, successful organizations are, almost by design, extremely good at optimizing and defending the thing that currently makes them money, and extremely bad at deliberately damaging that thing in service of something unproven that might replace it. The bigger and more dominant the existing business, the harder that internal shift becomes, because there's simply more institutional weight, more careers, more infrastructure, and more shareholder expectation built directly on top of the status quo. This is also why the companies that do successfully navigate this kind of disruption tend to share a specific trait. Someone inside them, usually near the very top, has enough authority, enough ownership, or enough personal conviction to absorb short-term pain that no incentive structure would otherwise reward. Komori didn't save Fujifilm by predicting the future better than Kodak's leadership did. Both companies had access to essentially the same information. He saved it by being willing to shut down a business that had defined his company for 80 years, take the earnings hit, take the career risk, and trust that the capabilities underneath that business were valuable enough to build something new on top of. That's a much harder thing to ask of a large, professionally managed organization than simply seeing a trend coming. As for Steve Sasson's original prototype, sitting in the Smithsonian today, there's something almost poetic about where it ended up. It's not displayed as a symbol of a company's failure to innovate. It's displayed as exactly what it was, the first working digital camera in human history, built years ahead of the market that would eventually be built around it. The tragedy of Kodak was never a lack of invention. It was that the company invented its own replacement, understood precisely what it had built, and still couldn't bring itself to let go of the business that invention was designed to replace. That's the real story of Kodak. Not a company that didn't see the future coming, a company that saw it more clearly than almost anyone, and still couldn't bring itself to leave the present behind in time.